January 12, 1935, Daventry, Northamptonshire. The BBC transmitter at Daventry stood against the winter sky like a skeletal cathedral, its towers throwing shortwave voices across the English countryside and beyond. On this particular Thursday morning, a bitter wind cut through the Midlands, rattling the frozen bracken along the A5 road where a modified Handley Page Hayford bomber circled at 8,000 feet, its fabric-covered wings drumming in the cold. Below, parked in a field crusted with frost, sat a converted Morris van containing equipment that most of the Air Ministry considered little more than expensive theater. Coils of wire, cathode ray tubes, amplifiers assembled with the desperate ingenuity of men working against institutional disbelief. Inside that van, Robert Watson Watt watched a green trace flicker across a screen no larger than a dinner plate, waiting for something the rest of Britain's military establishment had declared scientifically impossible. The bomber passed overhead. The trace jumped. A single pulse of reflected energy, crude and unmistakable, sketched a peak across the phosphor screen that would reshape the architecture of modern warfare more profoundly than any weapon system designed in the previous century. But on that frozen January morning in 1935, it was merely a blip. And blips, the Air Ministry's established experts had assured their superiors, were not how you defended an island nation against the coming storm. By the winter of 1935, the landscape of European power had already begun its tilt toward catastrophe. Adolf Hitler had been Chancellor of Germany for 2 years. The Versailles Treaty lay in ruins. German rearmament, officially illegal under the terms of that treaty, proceeded with open contempt for international oversight. The Luftwaffe, forbidden by post-Great War restrictions, had been publicly announced in March of that year, and its expansion proceeded at a pace that terrified anyone in British intelligence paying attention. Hermann Göring, the rotund veteran fighter ace now commanding Hitler's aerial forces, spoke openly of bomber fleets that would darken European skies. In Westminster and Whitehall, a terrible arithmetic haunted the defense committees. Britain was an island. Islands could be blockaded, invaded, or simply reduced to rubble from the air. The Great War had ended with biplanes dropping small bombs by hand. The next war, strategists understood with increasing dread, would begin with waves of modern bombers carrying tons of high explosive against which there existed no meaningful defense. Fighter aircraft could intercept bombers, certainly, if you knew the bombers were coming, and from which direction, and at what altitude, and with sufficient warning to scramble your fighters and position them correctly in three-dimensional space. Without such information, defending Britain's airspace meant flying standing patrols that burned fuel, exhausted pilots, and covered pathetically small fractions of the sky. The mathematics were unforgiving. A bomber formation approaching at 200 miles per hour from the continent gave perhaps 15 minutes of warning once spotted by visual observers on the coast. By the time fighters climbed to intercept altitude and reached the projected position, the bombers would be overhead or past, their ordnance already falling on Portsmouth or Dover or the dockyards at Chatham. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, had articulated the public terror with brutal honesty in a 1932 speech to Parliament. The bomber will always get through. It was a statement of fact, not defeatism. The bomber would get through because there existed no method, no technology, no system capable of detecting aircraft beyond the range of human eyesight and sound-ranging equipment that became useless above 15,000 feet. This was the Britain into which Robert Watson Watt delivered his impossible proposition. Watson Watt was 43 years old in 1935, a Scottish physicist who had spent the previous decade at the National Physical Laboratory's radio research station at Slough, studying atmospheric phenomena, lightning strikes, ionospheric disturbances, the behavior of radio waves as they bounced and bent through layers of charged particles in the upper atmosphere. He was not a weapons designer. He did not come from military circles. His work involved tracking thunderstorms, improving radio navigation, solving the mundane technical puzzles of Britain's expanding communications infrastructure. But Watson-Watt possessed the particular variety of intellectual restlessness that sees connections between disparate phenomena. And in early 1935, when the Air Ministry's Director of Scientific Research, Harry Wimperis, issued a desperate call for ideas, any ideas that might provide early warning of aerial attack, Watson-Watt submitted a memorandum that most recipients considered somewhere between speculative and absurd. The memorandum proposed detecting aircraft by bouncing radio waves off of them. The concept was not entirely original. Radio interference from passing aircraft had been documented since the 1920s. Several researchers, including a team at the Naval Research Laboratory in America, had experimented with rudimentary reflection techniques. But Watson-Watt's proposal went further. He suggested building a network of transmitting and receiving stations that could not merely detect aircraft but determine their range and bearing with sufficient accuracy to guide defending fighters into position. He included preliminary calculations. He estimated ranges of 70 to 100 miles under favorable conditions. He proposed specific frequencies, power requirements, pulse timing intervals. The memorandum was detailed, confident, and precisely the sort of theoretical exercise that committees love to debate and delay indefinitely. What Watson-Watt did not anticipate was A.P. Roe, the Air Ministry scientist who read the proposal with something approaching religious conversion, who understood immediately that if this worked, if even a crude version of this worked, it represented nothing less than the difference between national survival and catastrophic defeat. Roe pushed the proposal up the chain with unusual urgency. Within weeks, Watson-Watt received authorization for a demonstration. Not a full prototype, not a funded research program, a demonstration. One test. Prove the concept or abandon it. Hence Daventry, hence the borrowed bomber, hence the improvised receiver in the back of a van, and Watson-Watt standing in a frozen field on January 12th watching a green trace jump as electromagnetic energy reflected off aluminum and fabric 8,000 feet above his head. The demonstration lasted less than 20 minutes. The results were indisputable. The trace jumped consistently as the aircraft passed through the beam of the BBC transmitter. Watson-Watt immediately requested funding for a proper experimental station. By May 1935, construction began at Orfordness on the Suffolk coast, a desolate shingle spit jutting into the North Sea, chosen for its isolation and its unobstructed view across potential approach routes from Germany. By June, the first purpose-built transmitter was operational. By September, the system was detecting aircraft at distances exceeding 60 miles. By 1936, the range extended past 100 miles, and the Air Ministry, now genuinely alarmed by German aerial expansion, authorized the construction of a chain of stations spanning the southern and eastern coasts of England. They called it Chain Home. 20 main stations, stretching from Southampton to Newcastle, each centered on steel towers 350 feet tall, structures so large they could not be hidden, so distinctive that German intelligence immediately identified them, and so poorly understood by German analysts that they were consistently dismissed as ineffective or insignificant right up until the summer of 1940, when their true capability became lethally apparent. The British did not call it radar in 1935. That term, an American acronym for radio detection and ranging, would not enter common usage until the early 1940s. The British called it RDF for range and direction finding, a deliberately bland designation meant to obscure its function from foreign intelligence. The technology was classified at the highest levels. Personnel were vetted extensively. The operations rooms where radar data was collected and plotted were secured behind guarded doors and buried under layers of institutional paranoia that bordered on absurdity. Men and women working in those rooms signed the Official Secrets Act multiple times. They were forbidden from discussing their work with family, friends, or fellow service members outside their immediate section. The secrecy was not melodrama. The British understood with cold clarity that if Germany recognized the capability and significance of radar early enough, they would adapt their tactics, develop countermeasures, or simply attempt to destroy the stations before war began. Secrecy bought time. Time bought operational surprise. And operational surprise, in the summer of 1940, would mean the difference between British survival and invasion. But that summer still lay 5 years ahead. In 1935 and 1936, radar was a laboratory curiosity struggling toward operational viability. The equipment was temperamental, the ranges were inconsistent, the accuracy left enormous margins for error. Early systems could determine range reasonably well, but bearing only crudely, within sectors several degrees wide. Altitude determination was particularly problematic. The system measured elevation angle, but converting that angle to actual altitude required knowing the range precisely and correcting for atmospheric refraction, ground reflections, and the curvature of the Earth. The data required extensive interpretation by trained operators who learned through repetition and instinct to distinguish genuine aircraft returns from weather interference, ionospheric anomalies, and the electronic noise that plagued every radio system of the era. The operators, most of them young women recruited from civilian life and trained in the peculiar alchemy of reading green traces on cathode ray tubes, became the human filters through which raw electromagnetic echoes became actionable intelligence. Without those operators, radar was merely expensive equipment generating ambiguous data. With them, it became a weapon system. By 1938, as Hitler annexed Austria and began his dismantling of Czechoslovakia, the chain-home network was substantially complete. The towers stood along the coast like monuments to a future most people did not yet comprehend. Testing intensified. They were obsolete almost immediately. Post-war radar technology moved to higher frequencies, smaller antennas, solid-state components that bore little resemblance to the massive steel structures and valve-based equipment of the 1940s. But their obsolescence does not diminish their historical significance. For a critical 18 months, those towers and the system they anchored represented the difference between British surrender and British survival. The young men flying Spitfires over Kent owed their lives to electromagnetic pulses they never saw, reflected off enemy aircraft they had not yet spotted, interpreted by women they never met, relayed through command structures invisible to them. The system saved them. And in saving them, it saved Britain. And in saving Britain, it preserved the springboard from which, eventually, the liberation of Europe would be launched. There exists a photograph, taken in early 1941, of WAF operators in a chain-home receiver room. They sit at their consoles, headphones on, watching cathode ray tubes that display green traces against black screens. The traces are faint, almost imperceptible in the photograph. The women are young, 19 or 20 years old, most of them. They wear the severe uniforms of the period, hair pinned up, expressions professionally neutral. They look like clerks or secretaries, which is what many of them had been before the war. Nothing in the photograph suggests the weight of what they carried. The knowledge that reading those traces correctly meant fighters scrambled in time, and reading them incorrectly meant bombers unopposed and cities burning. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They did not fire weapons or storm beaches, but they fought nonetheless. In rooms lit by phosphor glow and the muted hum of electronics, translating invisible energy into actionable intelligence, watching for the pulses that meant hostile aircraft inbound, calling the numbers calmly into microphones that connected to operations rooms where controllers moved fighters across the sky like chess pieces in a game where every move was written in lives. The Battle of Britain passed into legend even before the war ended. Churchill's speeches enshrined it. The fighter pilots became icons, the few who stood between civilization and darkness. The narrative simplified, inevitably, as narratives do, into stories of dogfights and heroism, of Spitfires and Hercules dueling Messerschmitts above the White Cliffs. Those stories are not false. The courage was real, the sacrifice was genuine. But beneath the mythology lay the prosaic, unglamorous reality that battles are won not just by bravery, but by systems, by logistics, by the ability to process information faster than your opponent and translate that advantage into tactical superiority. The pilots were essential, but they were one component in a larger mechanism, and that mechanism's effectiveness depended on the tall steel towers along the coast transmitting pulses into empty air, and the young women in underground rooms interpreting the echoes that returned. In the decades after the war, as archives opened and histories were written, the full significance of radar became clear. Veterans who had fought without knowing what guided them learned about the invisible hand that had positioned them. Luftwaffe survivors, reading British accounts, finally understood why their attacks had been met with such consistent resistance. Watts dismissed absurd theory was recognized as one of the war's pivotal innovations. RAF fighters flew practice interceptions guided by radar plots relayed through the embryonic command and control system that would eventually become the famous operations rooms depicted in wartime photographs. Large tables covered with maps, young women in uniform moving wooden blocks representing aircraft formations, controllers directing fighters by radio telephone in clipped, efficient exchanges that reduced aerial combat to vectors and altitudes. The system worked. Imperfectly, yes, with gaps and limitations, certainly, but it worked. And in September 1938, during the Munich crisis, when war seemed imminent and Britain braced for immediate German attack, the radar stations went on full alert for the first time, scanning continuously for hostile formations that, in the event, did not come. Not yet. Chamberlain returned from Munich waving his scrap of paper, proclaiming peace in our time, and Britain gained another year to refine the system that would shortly prove to be the only reason peace did not end in conquest. The young men joining the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s believed, with the absolute certainty of youth and propaganda, that they were entering an invincible force. German aerial doctrine, forged in the crucible of the Condor Legion's experience in Spain, emphasized close coordination with ground forces, precision bombing of tactical targets, and the use of terror bombing to break civilian morale. The Luftwaffe had modern aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter, the Heinkel H-11 and Dornier Do-17 bombers, the infamous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber with its sirens designed to amplify psychological impact. German pilots trained extensively. German tactics were innovative. German confidence, by the spring of 1940 after the astonishing victories in Poland and France, approached the mythological. The Blitzkrieg had crushed every opponent. Poland fell in weeks. France, the great military power that had bled Germany white in the previous war, collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped at Dunkirk, abandoning its heavy equipment on the beaches. By June 1940, Germany dominated Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. Only Britain remained unconquered, and Britain, everyone understood, was next. Hermann Göring, promoted to Reichsmarschall after the French campaign, assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the Royal Air Force in a matter of weeks, achieving the air superiority necessary for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. German intelligence estimated RAF Fighter Command possessed approximately 600 modern fighters, Hurricanes and Spitfires concentrated in southern England. The Luftwaffe could deploy nearly 3,000 aircraft from bases in France, Belgium, Holland, and Norway. The arithmetic seemed decisive. Göring's plan was straightforward. Destroy RAF fighters in the air and on the ground. Bomb the aircraft factories producing replacements. Smash the infrastructure supporting Fighter Command. And once British air resistance collapsed, proceed with invasion. German bomber crews, briefing for the initial raids in July 1940, anticipated light opposition, scattered defenses, and the same rapid collapse that had characterized every previous campaign. They had seen Polish towns burning, French columns strafing, British troops fleeing across the Channel. They had every reason to believe Britain would follow the same trajectory from resistance to defeat. What they did not know, what German intelligence had catastrophically failed to understand, was that the tall towers along the British coast were not primitive radio direction finders of limited utility. They did not know that every major raid they launched was detected within minutes of forming up over France. They did not know that British controllers were watching their approach routes, counting their aircraft, estimating their targets, and vectoring defending fighters into position with a precision and efficiency that made interception not a matter of luck but systematic execution. German bomber crews, crossing the channel at 15,000 feet in neat formations that looked invincible from within, had no way of knowing that RAF fighters were already climbing to meet them, guided by invisible hands to the precise coordinates where interception became slaughter. The battle opened tentatively in early July 1940 with probing raids against Channel convoys and coastal targets. Skirmishes meant to test British defenses and draw RAF fighters into attrition battles over the water where German fighters, operating at the limit of their range, could still provide some escort. The British responded cautiously, conserving their fighters, refusing to commit large numbers to what were obviously diversionary attacks. This puzzled the Germans. Where was the massive defensive response they expected? Why were British fighters appearing in small numbers, engaging briefly, then withdrawing? German intelligence interpreted this as weakness, evidence that fighter command lacked sufficient aircraft or pilots to mount sustained resistance. They were wrong. The British were being guided by radar plots that showed which raids were significant and which were feints, allowing them to preserve their forces for attacks that actually threatened vital targets. On August 13, 1940, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched the full-scale campaign to destroy fighter command. Nearly 1,500 sorties struck targets across southern England, airfields, aircraft factories, radar stations themselves. The initial raids achieved tactical surprise in some locations. Damage was inflicted, aircraft were destroyed on the ground. But the fundamental pattern held. British fighters appeared precisely where they were needed, in numbers sufficient to disrupt bomber formations, forcing them to scatter ordnance short of targets or jettison bombs to escape. German losses were manageable but higher than anticipated. British losses were significant but sustainable. And as the campaign intensified through mid-August, the arithmetic began to turn against the Luftwaffe in ways German planners had not foreseen. RAF fighters damaged or shot down over England often saw their pilots recovered and returned to duty. German aircraft lost over England meant crews killed or captured. RAF fighters could land, rearm, refuel, and return to combat within an hour. German bombers, once across the Channel, had a single sortie before returning to France. And British production, despite German bombing, was replacing fighters faster than the RAF lost them, while German losses were mounting in a slow, grinding erosion that would become unsustainable by September. The Luftwaffe crews began to notice disturbing patterns. British fighters seemed to know they were coming. The interceptions were not random or opportunistic. They were precise. RAF fighters climbed to altitude before the German formations crossed the coast, positioning themselves up-sun, attacking from favorable angles. German escorts found themselves drawn into defensive circles trying to protect bombers that were supposed to be bombing and instead were jettisoning ordnance into the Channel or across the countryside to escape hurricanes and Spitfires coming in from multiple directions. The confidence of July curdled into the grim determination of August. Bomber crews who had flown 30 missions over France without seeing an enemy fighter were flying 3 missions over England and encountering coordinated resistance on each one. The invincibility narrative cracked, then shattered, then was quietly abandoned in favor of a simpler, darker truth. This was not going to be easy, and many of them were not going home. German intelligence did attempt to understand British effectiveness. Reconnaissance flights photographed the chain-home towers. Analysts noted their construction and presumed function. Several reports suggested they were connected to Britain's defensive coordination. But the institutional bias within the Luftwaffe worked against proper assessment. German radar research had proceeded along different lines, focusing on airborne systems and coastal defense against shipping rather than long-range early warning networks. German experts considered the chain-home towers primitive. The frequencies were too low, the pulse rates too slow, the bearings too imprecise to provide useful tactical data. They were correct on the technical details. The British system was primitive. But primitive systems operated by skilled people and integrated into effective command structures can defeat sophisticated systems poorly understood and countered inadequately. The Luftwaffe bombed several radar stations in August. They damaged equipment. They disrupted operations temporarily. But they did not appreciate the significance of those attacks, did not follow up systematically, and by late August shifted targeting priorities away from radar sites toward airfields and aircraft factories, allowing the British to repair damaged stations and continue operations with minimal interruption. It was a strategic blunder of profound consequence. Had Germany recognized radar's centrality to British defense and committed to its systematic destruction, Fighter Command's operational effectiveness would have degraded catastrophically. But they did not understand what they were seeing, and by the time they might have learned, the battle's outcome was already being decided. September 15, 1940, began as many of those late summer days began, with tension wound tight as watch springs in the operations rooms beneath Fighter Command headquarters and across the sector stations controlling the defense. The morning dawned clear across southeastern England, the kind of crystalline autumn weather that favored aerial operations and promised another day of maximum German effort. In the operations room at RAF Uxbridge, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group responsible for the defense of London and the southeast, watched the plotting table as reports filtered in from the chain-home stations. The first plots appeared mid-morning, large formations assembling over Calais and the Pas-de-Calais. The WAFs, the young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, moved their markers across the map as the formations grew. 20 aircraft, 50, 100, more. Park watched the numbers with the cold calculus of a man who understood he had finite resources against an enemy who seemed to possess infinite reserves, though in truth the Luftwaffe was nearing its breaking point as surely as his own command. The first wave crossed the coast shortly before noon. Radar plots showed more than 200 aircraft, bombers escorted by fighters, stepped in altitude from 12,000 to 25,000 feet, a vast aerial armada intended to overwhelm British defenses through sheer mass. Park scrambled every available squadron in 11 Group. He requested reinforcements from 12 Group to the north. Within minutes, more than 20 British squadrons, nearly 300 fighters, were climbing toward the incoming raid. The interceptions began over the Kent countryside. Hurricanes dove into the bomber formations. Spitfires engaged the escorts. The sky over southeastern England dissolved into a sprawling, chaotic melee of aircraft twisting and diving through condensation trails and gunsmoke. German bombers scattered. Several turned back. Others pressed on toward London, harried continuously by British fighters re-attacking in waves, single aircraft and sections diving through the formations, breaking cohesion, forcing the bombers to jettison their loads haphazardly across the southern suburbs. The Germans reformed over France and returned in the afternoon. Another massive raid. Another 200 aircraft detected by radar while still forming up over the French coast. Again, Park scrambled everything he had. Again, the reinforcements climbed from sector stations across the southeast. Again, the interceptions resolved into swirling combats that stretched across 100 miles of sky. By evening, the Luftwaffe had flown over 1,000 sorties. They had hit targets in London, they had inflicted damage, but the cost was crippling. German losses for the day approached 60 aircraft, bombers and fighters destroyed, damaged beyond repair, or so badly shot up that they would be weeks in maintenance. British losses were 26 fighters, with many of the pilots surviving to return to duty. More significantly, the RAF had demonstrated capacity that German intelligence insisted it no longer possessed. The British were supposed to be down to their last few squadrons, scraping together remnants to mount token resistance. Instead, they had met the largest German raids of the entire campaign, with coordinated multi-squadron interceptions that suggested reserves and organizational capability far beyond what Luftwaffe planners believed possible. September 15th did not end the Battle of Britain. Fighting would continue into October, but it marked the psychological and operational inflection point where German hopes for quick victory died. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion barges assembled in Channel ports began to disperse. The Luftwaffe shifted toward night bombing, terrorizing British cities, but no longer attempting to destroy fighter command in daylight battles where the losses had become unsustainable. The British had held. Against all pre-war predictions, against the apparent arithmetic of force ratios, against the psychological weight of every previous German victory, they had held. And the margin by which they held was measured in minutes. The minutes gained by radar detection, the minutes gained by efficient command and control, the minutes that allowed fighters to be in the right place at sufficient altitude to intercept formations before they reached vital targets. Without radar, British fighters would have flown blind, relying on visual observers who might spot a raid only when it crossed the coast, leaving insufficient time to climb to combat altitude. Without radar, Park would have been forced to fly standing patrols that exhausted his aircraft and pilots while covering pathetically small fractions of the sky. Without radar, the arithmetic that doomed every previous defensive campaign would have doomed Britain as well. The young German aircrew who survived the battle and returned to bases in France no longer spoke of invincibility. They spoke of the uncanny precision of British interceptions, the way RAF fighters seemed to know where to wait, the grinding attrition of flying missions where you lost friends on every raid and the target list never shortened. They did not understand the technical mechanisms behind British effectiveness. Radar remained a closely guarded secret, but they understood its effects. The confidence that had carried them through Poland and France had been burned away over England, replaced by a grim awareness that they were fighting an enemy who saw them coming and knew how to make them pay for every mile of British airspace. In the operations rooms, the WAF plotters continued their strange balletic dance around the tables, moving markers, updating positions, speaking in calm voices that reduced aerial combat to coordinates and altitudes. The system they operated, the integration of radar detection, communication networks, command centers, and fighter squadrons, represented something genuinely new in military history. A defensive system predicated not on physical barriers, but on information dominance, on seeing the enemy before he saw you, on converting time into tactical advantage. It was a system assembled desperately, refined frantically, and operated by people most of whom had been civilians 2 years earlier. It worked because it had to work. There was no fallback position. There was only the channel, and beyond that, invasion. The symbolism embedded in radar technology extended beyond its tactical function. In a deeper sense, radar represented democratic pragmatism confronting authoritarian confidence. The British system was not elegant. It was cobbled together from disparate components, improved incrementally, operated by hastily trained personnel who learned as they went. It succeeded not through ideological certainty or the brilliance of a single leader, but through institutional flexibility, through the willingness to test unconventional ideas, to empower mid-level scientists like Watson Watt and operational commanders like Park to make decisions without layers of approval, to trust young women with minimal training to interpret data that determined life and death for hundreds of aircrew daily. The Luftwaffe, for all its technical sophistication and tactical innovation, remained locked within rigid hierarchies where bad news traveled slowly upward and questioning established doctrine invited career destruction. German intelligence reports suggesting British radar was more effective than assumed were filed and ignored. German aircrew reports describing coordinated interceptions were attributed to luck or exaggeration. The institutional culture that had produced such devastating victories in 1939 and 40 could not adapt quickly enough when confronted with an opponent who saw the battlefield differently. This pattern of technological innovation enabling strategic survival, of information dominance offsetting numerical inferiority, would repeat throughout the war. Radar technology evolved rapidly. Airborne interceptor radar allowed night fighters to find German bombers in darkness. Centimetric radar, with far greater resolution, enabled anti-submarine warfare that closed the Atlantic Gap and broke the U-boat campaign. Radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, vectored strike aircraft against ground targets, provided navigation beacons for bomber streams crossing enemy territory at night. The crude system Watson-Watt demonstrated in a frozen field in 1935 spawned a family of technologies that reshaped every dimension of the conflict. By 1945, no major military operation occurred without radar support. The electromagnetic spectrum had become contested battle space as significant as land, sea, or air. But in September 1940, radar was simply the thing that gave fighter command enough warning to survive. The pilots climbing into Hurricanes and Spitfires multiple times daily did not think about electromagnetic radiation or cathode ray tubes. They thought about fuel gauges and ammunition counters, about keeping formation, about the split-second decisions that meant survival or death at 400 miles per hour. The controllers directing them spoke in vectors and altitudes, reducing complexity to instructions that could be followed immediately. The plotters moving markers across the table focused on accuracy and speed, on getting the information correct because incorrect information meant fighters sent to empty sky while bombers reached their targets unopposed. Everyone involved understood their piece of the system without necessarily understanding the whole. It worked because each piece functioned reliably, and because the architecture connecting those pieces, the communication networks, the operational procedures, the command hierarchy, allowed information to move faster than the enemy. The Germans eventually developed their own integrated air defense system, Himmelbett, based on radar stations controlling night fighter sectors across occupied Europe. It was effective, at times devastatingly so, imposing heavy losses on RAF bomber streams. But it came later, built in reaction to British tactics, and it never achieved the strategic significance of Chain Home because Germany was not defending against an existential threat in the way Britain had been in 1940. Germany was the aggressor. German cities were bombed, German civilians killed, but Germany itself was never hours from invasion, never fighting for survival with its back to an ocean and a global superpower waiting to enter the war if Britain could just hold on long enough. The psychological and strategic contexts were different, and technology alone could not compensate for that difference. Watson-Watt, knighted for his contributions, continued radar research throughout the war. He worked on improvements, on countermeasures, as the Germans developed radar-absorbent materials and electronic jamming. He testified before committees. He wrote memoranda. He became a figure of some scientific celebrity, though the full story of radar's development remained classified until after the war ended. In later years, interviewed by historians, he spoke modestly about the Daventry demonstration, emphasizing the team of researchers who had actually built the equipment, the engineers who scaled it to operational capability, the operators who made it work under impossible pressure. He was not given to grand statements, but once, asked what he considered radar's most significant contribution to the war, he answered with the precision of a scientist who had watched his theoretical work become life and death reality. It gave the defenders time. Time to see the threat, time to respond, time to survive, and survival in 1940 was victory enough. The towers of Chain Home stood for decades after the war, some repurposed for civilian communications, others abandoned, corroding slowly in the salt air. A few were preserved as monuments. Most were eventually demolished. But recognition came slowly, Because radar's contribution was not dramatic in the way a particular battle or weapon system is dramatic. It did not win the war in a single stroke. It created conditions under which winning became possible. It bought time. It imposed costs on the enemy. It allowed a numerically inferior force to fight above its weight. And in 1940, when Britain stood alone, when the prospect of invasion was not theoretical but imminent, when everyday survival brought the possibility of American entry and eventual victory closer, the ability to impose costs and buy time was not merely important, it was everything. The great irony is that radar was not a secret. The physics were well understood internationally. The Germans had radar, so did the Americans, the Japanese, the Soviets. But having the technology and using it effectively were different challenges. And the British, through a combination of desperation, institutional flexibility, and intelligent integration of technology with operational doctrine, created a system that worked better than anyone else's at the critical moment. It was not superior German technology that won the early campaigns of World War II. It was superior operational art, the integration of armor, air power, and mobile infantry in ways that shattered static defenses. Similarly, it was not radar technology alone that saved Britain, but its integration into a defensive system, where technology, communications, command structures, and human operators functioned together with sufficient efficiency to counter an enemy who, by every conventional measure, should have won. Wars are full of such moments where the expected does not occur, where the obvious outcome fails to materialize, where the side that should lose somehow prevails. Usually, the explanation involves some combination of leadership, morale, luck, and the thousand small factors that aggregate into large consequences. In this case, the explanation includes an electromagnetic pulse bouncing off aluminum, interpreted by trained observers, relayed through telephone lines to controllers who translated it into vectors and altitudes, guiding young men in fast aircraft to precise positions where they could disrupt enemy formations that had not expected organized resistance. It is not a romantic explanation. It does not fit easily into heroic narratives. But it is true, and its truth contains a lesson more valuable than romance, that survival in the face of overwhelming threat depends not on miracles, but on preparation, on the willingness to pursue unconventional ideas, on building systems that work even when they are not elegant, and on trusting people, including those society had not previously trusted with significant responsibility, to perform under pressure. On a winter morning in 1935, a green trace jumped on a phosphor screen in a van parked in a frozen field. 5 years later, that jump became a network of towers and cables and people watching screens and moving markers and speaking into microphones, and together those components formed a shield that bent but did not break. The shield was not visible. It existed in electromagnetic pulses and organizational structure, in the training of operators and the discipline of pilots, in the calm voices relaying information and the split-second decisions made at 400 miles per hour. It held because it had to hold. And because it held, the outcome that appeared inevitable in June 1940, German conquest of Britain, the end of organized resistance in Western Europe, the consolidation of Nazi control over the continent, did not occur. The war continued. The alliance formed. The tide turned. And all of it, in some measure, traces back to the moment when institutional skepticism gave way to experimental evidence, when an absurd theory became operational reality, when Britain decided that survival required believing in invisible pulses and trusting the people who could read them. The towers are gone now, most of them. The operations rooms are museums. The veterans have aged and passed. But the principle remains, that seeing the enemy before he sees you, knowing his position before he knows yours, possessing information while he operates in ignorance, these advantages, unglamorous as they are, matter more than courage or technology in isolation. They are the difference between fighting blind and fighting with eyes open. And in the summer of 1940, when Britain fought for its life with its back to the sea, the difference between fighting blind and fighting with eyes open was the difference between annihilation and endurance, between conquest and freedom, between the end of resistance and the beginning of victory.